Let's go back to the history of this whole thing. Processed food, sugar, in the big scheme of things, this is a relatively new issue that humans have had to deal with. Let's go back to the roots of that. How far back does it go, and how did that all become a thing?
Well, sugar's been around since 1200 BC. The Indians, I don't mean the American Indians, the Indian Indians, were able to figure out that they could boil sugar cane down to this brownish, gunky liquid, which was very sweet, which they could then transport. And this stuff was called khanda, Khanda. And of course, that's the derivation of our word candy. It was a delicacy. It was a, rarity. Really through the Middle Ages, only kings could get sugar. And in fact, in many European monarchies, sugar was fetishized. They made like sugar sculptures and stuff, because it was like gold. And, in some places, sugar actually cost more than gold for many years. And of course, that was the genesis of the slave trade, through the 15, 16, 1700s was all about sugar, molasses to rum to slaves. Bottom line, we built the country, on the backs of slaves, to grow and process sugar, because sugar cane production was backbreaking work. And even today, sugar cane production is associated with all sorts of chronic diseases in the workers. Right? And sugar production is associated with destruction of the Amazon, and it's associated with phosphate runoff in Lake Okeechobee and throughout the Florida Everglades. It's killing the Everglades, all because of sugar production. So this is an enormous problem. And there are many books that have been written on this, like Sweetness and Power by Sidney Mintz and several others. There was another one came out of Canada not too long ago, A Bittersweet History of Sugar. That's right. So this is part of what drove, society forward, but in a very, very bad way. And of course, then oil took over back in 1900. It took over for sugar, in terms of destroying our environment and, but generating, maximum profit. And the bottom line is, they're both hedonic substances.
What I was getting at there is, wasn't a big climax point for sugar when low fat became a thing, like in the 70s?
In 1955, President Eisenhower had a heart attack. He was actually laid up for 6 weeks. And the whole country went berserk. Like, heart attack. And the fact of the matter is that the frequency, the incidence and prevalence of myocardial infarction had been going up and up and up and up. It had been documented by Paul Dudley White, who ended up becoming Eisenhower's physician back in the 1940s. The increase in the rise in heart disease in the United States. But when Eisenhower had a heart attack, that was sort of like the tipping point for this. What causes heart disease? And two camps, basically sprung up from that. One, led by a British physiologist, nutritionist, physician by the name of John Yudkin, said that he believed that sugar was the driver of heart disease. He had correlation. He didn't have causation. But he basically showed that wherever sugar went up, heart disease went up. The other camp was the fat camp, the saturated fat camp. And that was led by a Minnesota epidemiologist by the name of Ansel Keys, who was already famous because he was the inventor of the World War II K ration. That was the Keys ration, 12,000 calories in a little tin box that soldiers could take, into battle. And he did a sabbatical in England and saw that everybody in England was dying of heart disease. And he went to the Mediterranean, he went to Pioppi, Italy, and he saw that nobody was dying of heart disease. And he decided, when he saw the fish and chips, that it had to be saturated fat. And so he put together a study, famous study, called the 7 Countries Study. Turned out it wasn't the 7 Countries Study, it was the 22 Countries Study. And he cherry-picked the 7 countries that basically gave him the nicest curve of saturated fat and cardiovascular deaths. And said, see, it's saturated fat. He had correlation, not causation also. So these two, Yudkin and Keyes, duked it out through the 60s and 70s. Who won? Well, clearly, Keyes won. But the question is, why did he win? Did he win because he was right? No. Here's what happened. In 1973, Michael Brown and Joe Goldstein at University of Texas Southwestern discovered a molecule on the surface of liver cells called the LDL receptor. And the reason they discovered it was because they were studying patients who would die at age 18 of heart disease, a disease called familial hypercholesterolemia. So they knew that cholesterol was very high in the blood of these kids who were dying of heart disease. And they figured out it was because they couldn't remove the cholesterol from the blood. They couldn't remove the LDL from the blood because they were missing the receptor. Okay. They then demonstrated that dietary fat raised your LDL level. That's also true. And then other people, epidemiologists, showed that LDL levels in large populations correlated with cardiovascular disease risk, which is also true. So all 3 of those things were true. But the question was, did they make sense together? And the answer was no, they really didn't. But we strung a narrative together that we thought made sense. And Keyes pushed, vociferously. Basically, if dietary fat is A and LDL is B and heart disease is C, we learned that A led to B and B correlated with C, so A must lead to C. Therefore, no A, no C. Get rid of the dietary fat, lower your LDL, and heart disease will go away. And Yudkin got thrown under the bus. And that was the end of John Yudkin. All of his work and, his reputation, etc., completely thrown into the dustbin of history. Well, turned out that wasn't true. But it took 50 years for us to figure out that it wasn't true. So it is true that A can lead to B, but it could also lead to D, E, F, G, H, and I and never come back to C. And the contrapositive of an argument is not no A, no C. It's really no C, no A. So it didn't even make sense on logistical grounds. But it took the empiric data, and it took the fact that 50 years of trying to get fat out of the diet only making things worse before people started saying, maybe we got this wrong. And so I happened onto the sugar question around 2007. And so I just happened to be in a good position at the time to be able to make the argument that actually sugar was the bad guy and, Yudkin was likely right. And, things have taken off from there.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch a full episode. I'll see you over there.
It's poison. And it actually detracts from metabolic health. And we have the data to show how and why. Because fructose